Good afternoon, everybody. Very happy to welcome you to the seminar of the Migration Governance Project, headed up by Alan Hirsch at the New South Institute, where Michael Mutava and Victor Mahdi and Alan are going to be presenting some of the case studies on Kenya and Nigeria from the MIGRA project. And we have excellent discussants in the form of Dr. Caroline Wanjiku-Kihatu and Amanda Bissong. I'm going to take literally a minute of your time. Alan doesn't really need an introduction. He's the Senior Research Fellow at the New South Institute, directing the research program, Migration Governance Reform in Africa, MIGRA. He's also a professional research associate at SOAS and emeritus professor at the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance. And of course, he's the founding director of the Nelson Mandela School, which I had the pleasure of teaching at that school in an earlier period. This project, I'm very excited that's part of the NSI. It's been running for 3 years now. And NSI, the New South Institute, is a global think tank based in South Africa. We tackle or deal with major policy challenges facing South Africa and other countries in the global south, from public service reform, challenges of governance. We work on corruption and state capture. We work in South Africa. We're working in cooperation with the Anti-Corruption Coalition based at Gibbs University, or Gibbs faculty at the University of Pretoria. We work on welfare reform, and then we have a very large international comparative program with an office based in Belgrade in Serbia and in the Balkans. And MIGRA fits into that program, into the larger program, and dealing with major policy challenges. Our specific focus, though, is on institution building and trying to understand various policy issues from the institutional complexities, from the kinds of institutions that must develop policy, but also in particular, especially to implement policy. And I think what's really important about this project is that it's focusing on the sort of general patterns of migration across the African continent, but ultimately with the purpose of trying to understand the institutions that must manage migration in various national contexts. On that note, I'm going to hand over directly to Alan and waste no time. And Alan, over to you. Alan, are you ready?
Thanks. Thank you very much, Ivor, and good afternoon to everybody. I'm going to start off just to say a few words about the project. The MIGRA project has been running for a couple of years. It took a little while to start up, and we are looking at migration governance reform in Africa. And essentially the purpose is to try to understand what are the pathways to safer, successful, freer, regular migration within Africa for Africans crossing African borders, and for other people within Africa crossing African borders. What are the pathways for improving that? And we've structured around 2 introductory papers, a framework paper and a paper on trends in demographic trends in Africa. Michael Mutava did the second paper, I did the first paper, and we've done 3 case studies: South Africa, Nigeria, and Kenya. We were going to do a 4th one, but unfortunately that hasn't happened as yet. We're also doing 4 regional cases. We're looking at SADC, the East African Community, ECOWAS, which is a paper which will be coming out very soon, and the African Union, and their role in creating, facilitating, or not, pathways for regular migration of Africans within Africa. And in the end, we'll do a kind of a synthesis paper, and hopefully we'll put it all together in a more refined form as some sort of collection later next year. So I'll start off looking at South Africa. South Africa, migration in South Africa basically suffers under the original sin of slavery and forced labor in South Africa. So there were people living in South Africa for many, many years. In fact, the first human footprint found so far was found 153,000 years ago on the shores of South Africa, the southern shores of South Africa. And people have been living for a long time. But colonial settlement took place in the 17th century, 1652. From the beginning, essentially, white settlers were encouraged. First Dutch settlers, then French Huguenot settlers, the Protestants who were fleeing Catholic oppression. Then, when Britain took over at the beginning of the 19th century, some British migrants came, especially after the Napoleonic Wars. But from the beginning, from the year after the arrival of the first Dutch settlers, slaves were introduced in the region. These were not local people who were enslaved. It was impossible, as it often is, to enslave local people or to encourage them to work under any circumstances. So people were imported from what was then called Batavia, or Indonesia, Malaysia area. A lot of South Africans today have that origin, and from Madagascar, from Mozambique, and other parts of Africa. By the beginning of the 19th century, the Cape was essentially a slave society. In fact, the density of slaves to free citizens was greater than that in, for example, the southern states of the United States, which is known as a slave society. The Cape was even more of a slave society. Slaves were freed in South Africa in the 1830s, but I have an ellipsis after the 1830s because essentially many were forced into indentured labor of various kinds, and then later were forced into effectively a form of forced migrant labor. I won't go into that in any detail. Safe to say that from the 1870s, when the diamond mines began to operate in South Africa, there were people from outside of the borders of South Africa as it was then defined, and I won't go into the details on that either, from Mozambique, for example, and other parts of the region, Botswana, and more than a third, in fact, of the workers on the diamond mines from very early on were people from outside of the boundaries of what's now South Africa. It was formalized in a treaty with Portugal in regard to migrant workers from Mozambique. And what was essentially formalized was what the migrant workers could not do and what they were not entitled to. They could not live in South Africa. They had to return regularly to Mozambique. They didn't have any rights in South Africa, and the mine owners essentially had all of the rights. And those what happened in after Union and that was essentially when the British and the Afrikaners agreed on a form of government in 1910. There were a series of restrictive legislation, including the so-called Admission of Persons to the Union Act, which essentially said who couldn't come and be admitted freely to the Union, which was Black Africans. So from that moment, there was a distinction, what Jonathan Crush calls the two-gate system: one gate for white Europeans, another for Black Africans. So that law, incidentally, was also used to block Catholic and Jewish immigrants into South Africa in the 1930s. But by 1970, which was the high point of gold mining in South Africa, there were 370,000 black miners, of whom a vast majority, 265,000, were from outside South Africa. All were temporary, including those who lived in South Africa, were not allowed to stay on the mines or in the towns near the mines. They lived in compounds and had to return to the so-called Bantustans. From the 1970s and accelerating in the 2000s, there's a decline in the number and proportion of foreign mine workers. And these foreign mine workers, it has to be remembered, come from the poorest countries in the region. And I'll show you the next slide, the outcome of that. So what happens is you have a very significant decline in the number of migrant laborers from outside the country on the mines. First of all, it's for security reasons. After the independence of Mozambique and Angola, the mine owners were afraid of using people from that area. Then it's for political reasons, South Africans wanting to have preference in terms of employment and agreements with the Chamber of Mines and the government that there would be a preference for South Africans on the mines. So what happens is that people move to South Africa, people from Mozambique, but that's partly for reasons I'll explain in a minute. People from Lesotho, two major suppliers to the mines, people from Malawi. And then if you look at the picture, on the right-hand side, you can see a massive influx from Zimbabwe, which happened mainly in around the period 2008 to 2010, during the economic and political crisis of that period. And the effect of this was that the number of foreign-born people living in South Africa rose from about 1 million in 2000 to about 2.9 million in 2020, using the UN figures, not the South African census figures, which are, I think, less reliable, and others might agree. I think, so it's a 200% increase in the foreign-born population. It takes the total of the foreign-born population up to about 5% of the total population, which isn't very large by global standards. In a country like the United States or Australia, the percentage of foreign-born people is about 15% to 20%. These are settler countries, countries of immigration. In South Africa, it's 5%, but the rate of increase from 1 million to 3 million in a relatively short period of time is much faster than in most other circumstances. So we'll move to the next slide. So after 1994, which was the transition to democracy, things changed quite dramatically. There had been no provisions for refugees, for example. Refugees weren't recognized in any way up to 1993, just before the transition, when Mozambicans were recognized as refugees. They'd been refugees from the civil war in Mozambique and some disasters in Mozambique as well. Many of them were regularized by South Africa, basically allowed to stay and to become residents in South Africa in 1997. Several 100,000 people it affected. In the same period, and during the Mandela presidency, you had the Refugee Act in 1998, and a little bit later in the Mbeki presidency, the Immigration Act. And what you found in the Mandela period in particular, a very, very strong commitment to human rights, including signing on to the UN treaties on refugees without reservation, unlike many other countries which had reservations, and also signing on to the OAU treaties on refugees. So that was a very strong human rights commitment, but at the same time, there is an emphasis in the legislation on sovereignty and growth, and there was clearly a tension within government over those issues. To what extent are we protecting our borders? To what extent do we just want skilled people so that we can grow, or are we open to accommodating refugees? And that was a tension at that time, settled in favor of the humanitarian instinct in that period. Around the time of the introduction of the Immigration Act, you also had the extension of corporate permits for foreign migrants. That meant that companies could have agreements to allow foreign migrants to stay in South Africa or to revisit South Africa over a multi-year period, 3 years or 5 years, which gave some certainty. But the bilateral agreements, the bilateral labor migration agreements, which were originally stemmed from that Portuguese agreement in 1901, but most of the existing ones are from the apartheid. They're all from the apartheid era. They haven't been changed significantly from the apartheid era. So we still have bilateral labor agreements with a number of 5 neighboring states, which essentially don't give any kinds of significant rights to workers when they're in South Africa. In addition to that, in relation to the region, we had the failure of a South African SADC protocol, South African Development Community Protocol in 1995, which was a protocol for free movement. And then in 2005, there was a South African initiative, which was supported by some countries to have a different agreement, an agreement on facilitation, a soft agreement, but that wasn't agreed to by a majority either. But there have been bilateral processes in the region, and most countries are visa-free to each other within the SADC region at the moment. What also happened in just about 12, 13 years ago was the Zimbabwe crisis, and Zimbabweans were allowed to remain in South Africa under exemption permits, which were also had been extended to Lesotho when they had a crisis. So there are people today still from Zimbabwe and Lesotho living in South Africa under exemption permits. I might get back to that a little bit later. But you had a tightening up of policy in that era. So you have more and more restrictions being placed basically on migrants. You had a critical skills list introduced, which was quite restrictive in terms of migrants who could enter South Africa. And in 2017 and 2023, you had white papers on immigration. The second one, really almost an election-prepared manifesto saying we're not going to allow refugees the kind of freedoms that they've had in the past. If refugees come, they have to apply at regular ports of entry for refugee status. Otherwise, they will be considered to be in the country in bad faith, and similar kinds of commitments. Whereas the current legal situation, so that white paper wasn't actually applied. The current legal situation is that if you are seeking asylum, you are entitled to work, and you're also entitled to social benefits, or some social benefits, not housing, but you're entitled to healthcare, for example, and access to education. The proposals were that those rights would be removed and the situation for refugees would become much more restrictive. Okay, we'll move on. So with the tightening of the system, basically, and the defensiveness which came about really as a result partly of the very rapid migration that took place in the 1910s, in the noughties and the early 1910s, but also because of the global financial crisis, which meant a significant increase in unemployment in South Africa. The rules tightened, but the capacity of the institutions didn't. And you had a weak Department of Home Affairs, which became even weaker. You had bribery and corruption happening quite widely. That was seen in a number of cases. Even the introduction of VFS, which you will know is a private immigration service at the front line, didn't change things because the ultimate decisions about permits and visas were made in Pretoria in a centralized way in the department, and that allowed for corruption. You had a deterioration of the institutions that was quite dramatic and quite rapid. The Department of Home Affairs was beyond the control of the minister even. There was a court case in which an affidavit allegedly from the minister was presented, which the minister later denied he had made and even knew about the court case, which was a court case essentially saying, opposing or asking for permission to extend for an extension of the period in which a law had to be introduced, which had been required by the Constitutional Court. So the department was out of the control of the minister, and the minister instigated an investigation. On the right-hand side, you'll see the Lubisi committee. Lubisi, who had been this cabinet secretary, led a committee which had very, very substantive findings, a lot of fraudulent applications, abuse of systems. The electronic systems were not used. Manual systems were used because they were easier for corruption to take place. There's no integrated database. So that meant that people could apply for different visas at the same time. And the population and naturalization databases didn't match. The V list, which is a list of illegal immigrants or dangerous potential immigrants, was fatally flawed. So they didn't know who to watch out for at borders. And there were recommendations that there should be criminal investigations and prosecution, build an integrated common database, and restaff the Department of Home Affairs quite dramatically. So that was the situation essentially in the last government, the previous government, before July this year. Will we move to the next slide?
Alan, just to say that we're on 20 after 20 past. How many more? Do you need another 5 minutes?
Yeah. Okay, so I won't go into detail, but in July this year, the Government of National Unity was formed, which gave a lot more freedom to, it seems, to ministers. And the new minister is from the DA, which is a center-right party. He's a young man with a PhD from the Free University of Berlin in political science. And the very first day he was in office, he extended a blanket waiver for visas extension to all people who hadn't received their visa responses on time. And then there were a whole series of reforms which I've catalogued here, virtually once or twice a month, Schreiber would come forward and say, I'm making this reform and that reform and this reform and that reform, and essentially reforms that have been called for by people trying to reform the system. So far, it's not possible to know how well those reforms are being implemented, but there has been a very quick and very radical reform of the policy framework, which could have significant implications. It's interesting. Sorry, Ivor, I just want to make this point that the Government of National Unity in South Africa, in a way, parallels the Government of National Unity in Zimbabwe of about 12 to 14 years ago, when in that period they were also able to make some significant positive reforms. So I'll move on to the second last slide. So there's still a lot of things that haven't been done. We still have the bilateral labor agreements, which are the echoes, really, of a system of slavery and forced labor. We still haven't got any kind of SADC agreement on the movement of people. Whatever we have is bilateral. There's a proposal for quotas for foreigners that in a law that was actually prepared, but it hasn't gone before Parliament, and it's not clear what's going to happen there. Not all the corrupt people have been prosecuted. Will that be extended? And will the Department of Home Affairs be able to implement the reforms that they have? It's one of the few departments which has actually had not only a inflation-related, but an actual cut in its budget over the last couple of years and in forthcoming years. So it's quite worrying that the reforms that have been proposed won't be able to be implemented. And finally, so what have we learned? Well, we learned that the weight of history is very heavy. We still have the bilateral labor agreements, even in a democratic South Africa. The gap between rhetoric and policy, thank goodness, is very large. The rhetoric of the last election was extremely xenophobic from most of the political parties. The policies have never been as bad as the rhetoric, but of course the rhetoric affects the attitudes of ordinary people, gives them license to behave badly if they want to. The changing circumstances of the global financial crisis and the Zimbabwean crisis had an impact on the way policy was made. But now, what seems to be the removal of some political shackles in the Government of National Unity makes reform possible and back towards perhaps a more balanced approach to migration as we had in the 1990s. South Africa on my African issue remains an inward-looking regional hegemon, unlike perhaps Kenya, certainly Kenya, and perhaps Nigeria, which we'll be talking about afterwards. And this has been reinforced in South Africa by the poor economic growth and high levels of inequality, which make it easy to mobilize opposition to engaging in Africa in a more equal way. Thank you.
Alan, thank you very much. I think that presentation and case study is going to generate a lot of very interesting discussion. Let's move on now to the Nigerian case study. Dr. Victor Amadi will be presenting it. Currently a postdoctoral research fellow at the Center for Comparative Law in Africa, CCLA, at the University of Cape Town. Dr. Amadi, Victor, can you also 20 minutes, so ending in about 12 minutes too.
Right, thank you very much. I think I should be done in less than 20, hopefully. So good afternoon, everyone. So I will be sharing a bit about the migration governance framework in Nigeria, which, as Alan had mentioned, is part of the series towards the broader migration governance framework for the continent. So in terms of Nigeria, which primarily the focus of the paper I did, and trying to set a context in which the paper was developed, or just trying to broadly understand the governance framework within the Nigerian context. It's just basically understanding, what Nigeria is as a country in terms of its demography, and also what it really prescribes in terms of its approach towards migration. Primarily, Nigeria is hugely populated. Currently estimates around 220 million people, if not more. And based on its broad history, without going too much into detail, Nigeria has largely been a source and a destination country. Going into the historical sense, one looks at the fact that Nigeria, post-independence faced numerous coups, and also had that very devastating civil war for 3 years, which actually shaped the trend of internal migration within the country. And also in the 70s and the 80s, the discovery of oil and the recession thereafter also demonstrated a trend of external and also inward migration. So based on the extensive number crunching done by Michael, using the UNDESA tables, basically kind of emphasizes a particular trend when it comes to migration in Nigeria. And looking at that particular table, based on the report he did, in 2020, you had just about 1.6 million individuals living in Nigeria. And primarily, I think the movement amongst those specific number of people actually happened within the sub-region, which was quite interesting to note, primarily because also looking at the historical sense, when Nigeria discovered oil, most of those who were actually coming into Nigeria were individuals from the sub-region, and also during the colonial times, during the British colonial period, actually to sustain the labor market, most of the individuals who actually were used by British administration were individuals also from most West African countries. And looking at the the figures, approximately 58% move outside the continent. And those who migrate within the region, or the continent, actually move within the sub-region. But quite interestingly now, just noting this trend of immigration is just one of the most conversational topics in recent time, which is the Japa syndrome, which actually is a colloquial term that actually suggests run or flee. So it's just a term that demonstrates an exodus of young Nigerians, primarily trying to escape the economic hardship, issues around security, issues around poor infrastructure, and almost trying to seek a better life somewhere else within the continent or outside the continent. So it's just a question now of, trying to establish again this trend, how much of this trend, the implication of this trend towards governing migration, particularly because, understanding Nigeria is primarily tend to be reactive when it comes to developing policies and actually trying to regulate migration. And also in terms of immigrants, the figures sit at 1.3 million as of 2020, also with primarily those originating from West Africa. And this also throws the question of influence of sub-regional block frameworks within sub-regional blocks, which I think is quite instrumental also in shaping how Nigeria responds to governing its migration framework. So the next slide actually then looks at, coming from a legal standpoint, primarily doing a normative assessment. And this is likely the area in which I felt much comfortable exploring, understanding the basis in which Nigeria actually informs its own domestic policies. So for context, Nigeria operates as a dualist country when it actually interacts with international law. So fundamentally, whatever Nigeria opts to sign or whatever agreement it negotiates at international or regional levels, that agreement has to be translated into a domestic law. So it creates a necessity to compare how much its domestic frameworks actually comply with its international obligations. So Nigeria was one of the founding members of the Economic Community of West African States early in the 1970s or the mid-1970s, and was quite instrumental to creating that institution under the administration of General Yakubu Gowon. And just shortly after the institution was created, just in 1979, a protocol on movement of persons was adopted. And subsequent protocols to that to give substance to the very elements of that 1979 protocol was also negotiated and adopted in 1986, in 1990, and also in 1982, which actually gave definition to the, who an ECOWAS citizen is. So what this protocol actually suggests and really defines, and it will be very much described in the subsequent paper on migration governance in West Africa. But primarily what it suggests is within, stemming from the 75 treaty and also the 1993 treaty, the revised treaty, ECOWAS citizens fundamentally would have a right to enter, reside, and establish. But based on the 75 treaty, that right would only come into play if there is an agreement mutually agreed by all then 16 member states but now 15 member states. So that protocol then gave really impetus to actually informing what Nigeria would do at the national level, primarily because Nigeria was operating, in 63, was in 1960 when it got independent. Its first immigration act was in 1963, and that act was only revised much recently in 2015. So much of what really exists now is trying to more or less comply with most of the commitments under this sub-regional frameworks. So the next slide actually gives a sense of where Nigeria is in terms of its migration governance frameworks. So largely Nigeria, historically has been really plagued with conflicts internally, which really has, caused mass displacements, right from the 60s. And to more or less tackle that particular issue, of protecting the rights of IDPs and complying with its UN obligations, Nigeria had adopted, early in 2011, the internal displacement policy, and subsequent to that, negotiated, adopted a migration policy in 2015, and also revised the 1963 Act, which currently now reads as the 2015 Act, and 2017 regulation that actually gives substance to more of the contents of the Act. And in terms of its interactions with, understanding the trends and patterns now, in terms of how, the level of emigration is actually growing, and this emerging trend of young Nigerians actually leaving or seeking greener pastures, and Nigeria being a huge beneficiary of remittances from Nigerians in diaspora. Nigeria, adopted diaspora policy in 2021, and also trying to simplify its visa policy, because if you look at the Immigration Act, it really is quite detailed but very unclear at the same time, because it prescribes a lot of, 116 provisions, prescribes, having to adopt, for instance, a temporary residence visa or a short visit visa or a permanent resident visa, but very unclear as to the formalities, in applying for those visas, who these visas are actually targeted towards, and so much unclarity in that framework. But in terms of the visa policy, it tends to actually try to categorize what visas can be qualified or classified under a short visit visa, for instance, or a temporary residence visa or a permanent residence visa. And looking at the migration policy particularly, and one of the issues that is quite very important in terms of understanding how this whole institutional frameworks when it comes to regulating or implementing most of these frameworks, because the Immigration Act actually prescribes that much of what is done or implementing immigration issues actually falls under the directorship of the Comptroller General of Immigration. And under that, rather, the National or Nigerian Immigration Service, led by the Comptroller General on immigration, and under the Nigerian Immigration Service, the Act actually prescribes creating a directorate on migration, which basically would have institutions targeted towards regulating or informing regular and irregular migration. But what the migration policy actually does is shift or place much of the implementation of Nigeria's migration initiative, or generally the migration policy, putting it in the hands of the National Commission for Refugees, Migrants, and internally displaced persons, which, as we see in the next slide, is actually, one of the coordinative structures when it comes to, tackling these various facets when it comes to migration. So at the very top level, when it comes to the coordinative structure, you would have, for instance, the Ministerial Committee, which comprises, like, for instance, the Federal Ministry of Labor and Employment. You have the Ministry of Interior, and other portfolios that are relevant to migration. And at the very second level, we have the thematic or the technical working groups, which also, and then after you have the thematic working groups with specialized focus areas, like labor migration, issues relating to border management, for instance, issues relating to diaspora matters. And all of these institutions are coordinated by the National Commission for Refugees, Migrants, and IDPs. But the contestation generally looking at this whole framework built under the migration policy is now which institution primarily will be responsible for implementing what the policy actually suggests. Because there are competing mandates, primarily because you have an immigration service created by the Immigration Act to actually deal with matters relating to immigration. And you have an alternative institution in the NSI, the Commission for Refugees, Migrants, and IDPs, that basically has this coordinating role to ensure that most of what the policy suggests are implemented. So we'll just go to the next slides.
Victor, just to let you know that 5 more minutes, please.
Okay. All right, so this basically is just a snapshot of the coordinating structure to ensure the implementation of the migration policy 2015. So just to the next slide, just to quickly round up. So in trying to understand basically the frameworks when it comes to norms at the regional, national level, and just generally the institutions created to enable much of this different discriminative facets when it comes to this governance framework. I think one of the fundamental issues was just for me was just the lack of clarity as to the mandates when it comes to these different agencies. And also looking at the institutions, particularly the Immigration Service, I think one of the most conversed and talked about issues just around corruption, and also internally and externally applying for a passport as a Nigerian, the bureaucracy around that process, particularly for individuals in diaspora, and also the administrative mechanisms when it comes to applying for visas or international passports, as the case may be. And also what really caught my attention is just generally around data collection. So Nigeria was meant to hold its census last year. This is after 17 years of not having conducted a census. But that was postponed, and no date has been given as to when that census would happen. So one is working based off of known numbers when it comes to the individuals that are located within Nigeria or even outside Nigeria. So data is actually needed if one is actually thinking about how do you channel, migration towards development, for instance, and navigating much of the remittances into development infrastructures. And also the discourse around migration is not really something that is topical in Nigeria. At least to my knowledge, I don't really think it's a very topical issue, as the case is here in South Africa. But largely now, with the current trends of mass immigration from young people, potential issues around that, the brain drain. So it really needs to be something that needs to be talked about. And also abrupt border closures, not respecting commitments when it comes to most of this regional frameworks. So Nigeria, for instance, abruptly closed the borders in 2019 to deal with issues around smuggling of one of its key commodities. And that really didn't sit well with most of its neighboring countries, and also impacted individuals who were affiliated with border communities. And in terms of what I think should be done as recommendations, so one thing I really would suggest is, looking at South African experience, primarily dealing with corruption, for instance, is just generally having a sense of transparency on dealing with any matters relating to corruption. And also issues around bureaucracy and trying to simplify the processes when it comes to, for instance, travel documentations, visas, particularly from individuals in diaspora. Because, for instance, looking at, an expatriate coming from overseas to Nigeria, in applying for a temporary visa, for instance, you have to subject yourself to first, having your employer or your potential employer, getting an expatriate quota, certificate of approval. And, once that is sorted, you have to then get clearance in terms of applying for a residence visa, a residence permit that actually gives you the right to work and to reside in Nigeria. And this processes actually happen in isolation of each other. So ideally, trying to find ways to streamline these processes would actually go a long way in making this creating more appeal towards coming to Nigeria. And also, funding key border infrastructures or initiatives, and also having, data that actually gives more meaning and more effect to policy formulations. So those are the key recommendations coming from the paper. But I'm sure there are more recommendations coming through, but I would just keep it at that and just anticipate the questions and responses from the floor.
Victor, thank you very much for that presentation. Again, I think it's also going to generate lots of very interesting conversation, especially around the comparisons with South Africa. Let's move straight on. Michael Mutava Molai is an applied economist with experience in trade, capital markets, and regional integration. And of course, he's also a fellow at the New South Institute. Michael, over to you to tell us about Kenya.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ivo. So yeah, definitely.
20 minutes. Can I ask you just, watch the chat. Watch the chat area. I'll let you know in 10 minutes, and then I'll let you at 5, and then so just watch the chat area. I'll send you direct messages. Okay, thank you.
All right. Yeah, so I think I will probably take less than 20 minutes. I mean, given that we were looking at the same African countries, not the same, but countries in the same continent, and they have a lot of similarities. Some of the material might be repeated, but um, I have deliberately, knowing that I will be a third speaker, I have deliberately picked on some of the things that I probably thought would be left out by my colleagues. So I wrote the paper on migration governance reforms in Kenya. And just to give you a little bit of a background, the migration situation in Kenya is more or less of a friendly scenario. And, we're looking at maybe some of the learnings that we can get from this country case study and try to extrapolate it to other African countries. So how my paper proceeded was a little of a brief history of migration, starting from the pre-colonial era to the colonial and the post-colonial periods. And just to mention on the pre-colonial, this was a period where most of the migration was really for subsistence reasons. There wasn't a lot of you can't call it for at large scale for any other reason except for survival. All right. And then in the colonial periods, it was a little bit interesting because most of this was social engineering. You're finding that people would have restricted migration movement, social engineering. You have to move with your pass and so on and so forth. So there was a lot of social engineering. There was a lot of restriction. At the same time, this is the first time that we're beginning to get the idea of labor migration, because particularly in Kenya, there was an introduction of the hard taxes, in which case now people had to move so that they're able to raise that money for that tax, the hard tax. Essentially, if you have a man and you have a hut in your compound, then you need to pay for that hut. If you had many wives and you have around 3-4 huts, then you have to work 3 or 4 times as hard so that you're able to pay for each hut. So I mean, it was really, it had to force people, compelled people to move into the space of labor migration. And then that went on until we got our independence. And the post-colonial era is quite interesting, very interesting, because it marks different points or different things in the evolution of migration in Kenya. First of all, there was a sustained period where the purveyors of the colonial project departed the country, and that is a very some of the earliest instances of mass emigration. And then at the same time as we were gaining our independence, there was another important reason, and that was education. Just immediately after independence, and through the first president, Jomo Kenyatta, who himself learned abroad. He was a fervent fan of people moving abroad to acquire skills and then coming back. So there was that period of emigration, first by the colonialists themselves, and then also Kenyans seeking education and other greener opportunities abroad. And that marked sort of the first initial phase. Something else happened, and this is also very important in understanding the evolution of migration in Kenya. In the mid-70s, there was something else that was observed, and that was a return migration, not only by Kenyans, but also, very important, even some of the purveyors of the colonial project, some of the white people, so to speak, began to come back because of what they observed happen in the independence era. There was not a mass eviction of the colonialists, right? In fact, the victory speech of our first president, Jomo Kenyatta, he mentioned very clearly, very categorically, that the rights of all, irrespective of whether you're black, white, would be your rights to own property will be guaranteed. Your rights to live in Kenya will be guaranteed, except just one thing: you had to, to abandon your citizenship elsewhere and just claim the Kenyan citizenship. So that is important in understanding also some of the things I will be saying in the next few slides. Okay, so there was that period of return migration also by people that had already spent a while abroad, and that continues till today. 2015, the IOM conducted a survey, and they noted that up to 89% of Kenyans outside or are very much willing to come back to Kenya. So the paper goes on and talks about the trends and also some of the policies, which I will mention. As I said, I'm just picking out the juicy sections, and then we will, call it a day. Okay, the next slide. All right. So is Kenya a friendly nation? Because as I've said, Kenya is considered generally to be a friendly nation, but we want to look at some of the evidence. So this is an Afrobarometer survey where more than 50% of Kenyans, more than 50% really don't mind being next to foreigners. They absolutely do not mind. That was, and you can see also we have a huge population of refugees resident in Kenya as of 2023. But a more interesting survey is the Gallup Migration Acceptance Index, and Kenya is at 6.51 out of, I believe, 10. The global average is 5.3. Rwanda is at 8.16, and Tanzania is at 4.98. South Africa is at 4.2. I'm just picking some of the countries that would be our neighbors or would be key leaders in our continent. So looking at that, I mean, we can see clearly that South Africa is not the friendliest, but I mean, Kenya and Rwanda at least are somewhere among the friendly nations. So indeed, this is also stemming from, as I said, the political leadership of 1963 when we were getting our independence is very, very important when you're trying to understand why a nation probably is friendly or not friendly. Also, the leadership does play a key role. Please, the next slide. All right, so just to look at some of the key trends of migration in Kenya, we had a total of, in 2020, about 1 million immigrants and about 500,000 people outside of Kenya. That's 500,000 immigrants. And most of those that were leaving, just to note, they left to outside of the continent, what we call extracontinental migration, around 76%. And those that are resident in Kenya but are not Kenyans are mostly coming from other African countries, up to 93%. Among the million, up to 93% just coming from other African countries into Kenya. So you can see that most of these people coming into Kenya coming from other African countries, but Kenyans living outside of Kenya are actually going extra-continentally beyond the continent. Something else, we have about 50-50 chance for male and female immigrants. Okay, all right, noted. 50-50 chance, all right, for male and females. And then in terms of migrant density, that is the share of migrants to our population is around 2%. The mean age of our immigrants are at 31 years. Now, for Kenyans that are living abroad or living to go beyond the borders of our continent, especially outside, East Africa and Asia hosts mostly people for employment. And those ones that are going to Europe and North America are really mostly going for education, all right? There's more beautiful statistics in the paper. You can go read on it, just to understand the migrants into and out of Kenya. Something else very important I would like to mention is that Kenya has quite highly educated immigrants. More than 50% of them have a bachelor's degree. And most of this, when they go out there, they send their remittances back home to the tune of 4% of our GDP. That's a lot, right? That's a serious cornerstone of our economy. I believe remittance payments now are leading as our foreign earners, and then the outward remittances, we have about $500,000 again And most of this goes to Uganda and Somalia. And the reason why I highlight that is you'll realize that Uganda and Somalia, are important countries in Africa for Kenyan migrants and immigrants. Uganda is our main destination. Somalia is our main country of origin. That might be shocking to some of you. Please, the next slide. All right, so I deliberately titled this slide Immigrant and Border Management Policies because much as we've not talked a lot about it, we are also very particular about border management policies, right? We are not just, praying that we have free movement, but we're also very serious about border management. That is something that might be overlooked from this conversation, but just be certain that we're not advocating for just porous borders, but we want perfectly working border management laws. So just to mention, we have among the immigrant policies, we have a wonderful diaspora policy formulated in 2015, and it intends in its revision, I believe there's it's about to be revised. They want to now recognize the diaspora as the 48th county. Kenya has about 47 counties. We have a lot of bilateral agreements between Kenya and different countries, for example, Kenya and Germany, the UK to take nurses there, most of the Gulf countries. We do a lot of pre-departure trainings, all right, for certain vocations and so on and so forth. So all these are geared to the immigrants. Border management comes in when we start looking at what agreements the government is forming with other countries, and this is important. For example, with South Africa, Kenya has an agreement with South Africa so that it can South Africa can repatriate people who came to South Africa through Kenya illegally, right? So South Africa repatriates them to Kenya. Effectively, what that does is Kenya becomes sort of a border for South Africa. So this is a clever way to manage your border, as opposed to what? As opposed to militarizing your border. Some countries that we know that have really tough, militarizations at the borders. We have other countries that shut down their borders. Uganda and Rwanda, a couple of times, their borders have shut down, ignoring a huge cross-border, or they call it borderland economy, a microcosm of that survives at the borders. Very, very important. So one failed example in Kenya was in 2015, they decided to build a wall between Kenya and Somalia. And the project ended in 2019 after spending 35 million. Initially, the project was to last, I believe, 700 kilometers. But by 2019, and after spending 35 million, they had only constructed 10 kilometers. Please, the next slide. So immigrant policies. So in terms of our immigrant policies, the initial law that recognizes immigrant policies is in 1967 immigration law, which essentially was trying to define who a Kenyan is and who is not a Kenyan. Why is this important? Because remember, the white people would come in and out. Some of them had citizenships in Britain and so on and so forth. It was just simply a requirement to first be a Kenyan, and then the rest will apply to you. That is just the bit about defining who a Kenyan is. But in terms of immigrant policies now, our main law is the Immigration Act of, I believe, 2010. And then we have a couple of other legislations that aid or that help, all right? We also have a couple of leadership roles that come from Kenya, that is with regard to people like IGAD, COMESA, ILO, ESC, and so on and so forth. Next slide. So why some of the successes of the migration story in Kenya, all right? So there's the posture of the national government towards migration. It's good or it's positive, all right? When the government is talking internationally, it talks positively about migration. And this is true even locally, except for the one problem with refugees. They have a little bit of a problem with refugees, but as we will see in the second point there, local governments have actually a positive sentiment or attitude towards migration because of the borderland microcosms or the borderland economies, as we previously talked about. There are countries or there are communities that exist between borders and so on and so forth. So that creates or leads the local governments to believe that if they become very hostile to those communities, then they might lose out on one or two things. All right. So the other thing, as I want to mention, is the vibrant civil society. We have lots of cases that have been led by the vibrant corporate social CSOs. I don't know, the CSOs. Well, the civil society organizations. That's what I meant to say. So a lot of cases are led by such organizations and help a lot to entrench or integrate migrants and refugees in our cultures and in our communities. The last point why we are very successful is that we have a very strong and independent judiciary, because if you go to the courts and you have a weak judiciary, then you're not going to achieve much. The last slide, please. Yeah, so the matters that need to be fixed, what I did not mention among the immigrant policies, because I thought time was running out, is that Kenya had close to 6 types of visas prior to this year, the end of 2023, beginning of 2024. They were all scrapped off. The government brought what we call an ETA, electronic travel authorization. Is it good? Is it bad? It's neither here, nor here, nor there. Generally, for African countries, it's a bad thing. For countries outside of Africa, it's a good thing. So because we are trying to improve or look at ways in which we can improve migration in Africa, we feel generally that bit should be revised, the ETA bit, so that we're able to allow most Africans to move through Kenya. How it works is that you're able to require some pre-authorization online, and then you have to pay a fee around $30. Yes, it's a little bit cheaper than what was existing, but it's regressive when you imagine that some of these countries had visa-free arrangements bilateral with Kenya. So this is a step backwards for them. We also have rampant corruption, as we've previously mentioned, with the border in Somalia, the porous border, and the things about undocumented migrants. Currently, we have so much cases of femicide, and it has been traced. If you're watching news, it's been traced to people that came in illegally, some from Ethiopia, I believe that's in the news, and they're quite illegal. So if we can address that, the corruption, probably revise our ETA and update our refugee management strategy, I think that will be a wonderful thing to do for our country. All right. The last bit there, we need to also find ways to make sure that our social benefits, especially in terms of labor migration for the region, are transferable, so that when a Kenyan works in Uganda and their benefits are able, when they retire, to be repatriated back to their home country. So I think that's it from my end. Please go read the entire paper. We've talked a lot also about the, what is it called? The other portion about migrants. So please just go review the whole paper. You'll see a lot more information than I've covered there.
Michael, thank you very much for that. News from the friendly country. I can confirm that, having lived in Kenya for nearly a year in my young 20s, I think it was. Moving straight on, we've got 2 marvelous discussants. Amanda Bisong is going to start us off. Amanda Bisong is a policy officer in the migration and mobility team of the European Centre for Development Policy Management in Maastricht in the Netherlands. Amanda, over to you, your comments on the papers, and then we'll be followed by Dr. Caroline Wanjiku Kihatu.
Thank you. Can you
Amanda, about 10 minutes.
Yeah, okay, great. Thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this discussion, and also thank you for the very interesting papers. I've read the framing paper by Alan, so some of my comments will also touch on the framing paper by Alan. I think I'll just start. That's just because Michael's presentation also used the Gallup survey. So maybe I'll start with the Gallup poll on immigration, dropping a few figures. It says 37%, at least the recent one that was published, that 37% of people in sub-Saharan Africa want to immigrate. want to emigrate. And Nigeria, I think, has like 51%, Kenya, 39%, South Africa, 32%. And these are the 3 case studies that that we're discussing today. So that's interesting. When you see that figure, then it hits you. It's like, oh, wow, a lot of people in sub-Saharan Africa are thinking about emigrating. But then I'll put this side by side in the case of Nigeria, because Victor spoke about JACPA, which is like trying to flee, or the recent emigration trend in Nigeria. In 2022, PiggyVest, which is an investment or savings platform, released data saying that JACPA was one of the top 3 goals of Nigerians. And that was interesting. There was a whole buzz around it. And this year, PiggyVest also released data saying that the number of people saving for JACPA had reduced by 11%. Because of the inflation and the difficulty in the economy, JACPA is no longer one of the top 3 goals of Nigerians. Now Nigerians are more focused on saving for rent, saving for food, and saving for school fees and things like that. So these are some interesting figures. And I mean, once you see either of them, you could get carried away to say, oh, wow, lots of people want to move, or lots of people want to move, but they can't afford to move, bringing us back to this whole discussion about aspirations and capabilities, who wants to move, who cannot move, and all that. But anyways, interesting papers. It's interesting to see also that the studies here, these 3 case studies, really reflect some of the things that we've been seeing studying migration governance in Africa. And that's that even if you have this 37% of people who are interested in moving, most of them move within the regions, right? So these studies actually restate the importance of regional dynamics, because if you look at the Kenyan study or the Nigerian study or even the South African study, you see that a lot of this movement is going on within regions. And so that's an important aspect to always remember when we're talking about migration in the context of in the African context, and to try to see what we can do in terms of facilitating mobility, which is one of the broader goals of this MIGRA project. Again, these case studies reiterate what we find in other studies around the complexities of migration. So it's not just that you have one type of flow, it's usually that you have several types of people moving for several reasons on the continent. Most times you have mixed flows. There are people moving, you have short-term temporary cross-border movements, traders moving. You also have students moving. You have people moving for seasonal labor migration, a variety of movements happening at the same time at every border crossing. However, the policies usually don't reflect these varieties of movements. And I think that's one of the things that also came out from looking at the different case studies. There's a variety of flows, and while there are several policies, but these policies often have to catch up with what is happening in reality at the borders. Lots of people are moving. Often, sometimes these people move outside of spaces that are governed. So what does this mean then if the goal is to try to facilitate movement on the continent? And then again, you have to relate these movements that are happening with the priorities of the different countries when it comes to migration issues. Again, we see from the case studies the issues around tensions between migrants, refugees, host populations, and this is usually around limited resources, right? Alan spoke about increasing inequality, and we see also that these tensions are usually amplified around issues of resources when it comes to allocating some of these limited shared resources. And so the question, I think the much broader question here is the question around inequality, although sometimes we see that political realities usually try to shape these tensions between migrants, refugees, and local populations around other issues. And in the case of most African countries, usually around issues of belonging and identity. If we look at the policy landscape, which I earlier spoke about, we see that there are policies, right? In most of these case studies, we see several elaborate policies that have been developed by countries, sometimes sectoral policies being very elaborate, the case of the Nigerian visa policy. But what we see also is that its implementation, it's usually compartmentalized. So while there might be a very broad policy landscape, the government would choose to focus on certain areas when implementing some of these policies. Crowd pleaser is diaspora and remittances for various reasons among several African countries. This also resonates with some of the findings from my previous work, also with Francisca Zanca, where we saw that diaspora remittances is one of the areas that governments would like to work on, or that there is limited contestation in terms of migration governance. Again, issues around human rights comes up, but it's usually selective and depending on the rights of which category of migrants we're talking about. For governments, I think it's always important that they have to balance the various interests. So that means that while there's a huge landscape of different policies that have been adopted, the policies that are implemented are often isolated, right? So there is really no coherence in the implementation of these policies. Lastly, I see I have 5 minutes left, so I'd like to talk about political realities and how this is shaping migration on the continent. Most times when we talk about migration in Africa, we seem to idealize it as if it's all fine and nice, but we also see from these case studies that there are issues around securitization. There are also issues around anti-immigrant sentiments, issues around xenophobia when it comes to movement of people, also difficulties around visa access. So Michael just gave an interesting example about how Kenya has actually, in some cases, stepped back on its commitments by providing ETAs. And then again, we look at the whole discussion around social welfare of migrants on the continent, which is actually limited when you look at labor migrants moving from one country to another to work. Do they have benefits, health benefits, portability of social benefits? These are actually limited, but these are things that are not really talked about. But then again, you need to keep this side by side with the rhetorics around free movement on the continent and the whole political push towards implementing free movement protocols, especially as it relates to free trade agreements. Last point I'm going to make before I ask 2 questions is that we see that policy reforms are mostly unilateral, right? Alan spoke about that, unilateral policy reforms. There's also the Nigerian case around the new visa policy. These are unilateral. We see that also with Benin and Rwanda, where we have unilateral policy reforms. But REX also provides space for testing cases around mobility of persons, right? So the case of Kenya with EAC, or Nigeria with ECOWAS, who have successfully implemented free movement of persons. And we see that these regional frameworks also influence the way that national migration governance policies are implemented, or the way they evolve. So very interesting findings. I would just like to ask 2 questions in wrapping up. So the first one would be to any of the presenters around aligning the policies, the politics and the realities of people on the move, because we see that you have the policies in one space, you have different kinds of political issues going on, and then you see that there's the realities of people actually moving every day. And how do we align all this to create safer spaces and a safer movement for people on the continent? Thank you very much.
Amanda, thank you very much for your comments and for your questions, which I think the speakers will come back to in a moment. We have another outstanding rapporteur in this event, Dr. Caroline Wanjiku-Kihatu, who is a visiting researcher at the Oxford Department of International Development at Oxford University. She's also a research associate at the African Center for Migration and Society at Wits University, and is also a global fellow at the Wilson Center in Washington. Caroline, over to you. You've got 10 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ivor. And thank you to the North-South Institute for inviting me in this very important discussion. I think what I'll try and do is not maybe speak specifically to the presentations, but to take a step back and look a little bit at the context within which Africa as a continent and the regional blocs find themselves. And I think that when it comes to migration advocacy, both in South Africa and Kenya, and which are contexts that I know, so I'll refer to those a little bit more than I will to the Nigeria case, what we're seeing is the limits of traditional approaches to good migration governance. And as Alan said earlier, when he started his conversation, his presentation was that the idea is to think about how we can create a governance regime for migration that really addresses migrants and host population needs and the economies from which they're coming from and that are hosting them. And I think having been in this sector for now over 2 decades, and I'm sorry, I guess I'm dating myself. For years, advocates have, like me, have focused on highlighting on the hardships faced by migrants, emphasizing government obligations, legal obligations, and often citing, economic data that shows that migrants are not the problem, and in fact, they improve local economic contexts. And Alan's piece also talks a little bit about the sort of overwhelming economic argument for migration. But these tactics, these narratives, just aren't gaining traction in our current political and social context, and I think that it's easy to understand why. If we see migration as a process that's at the intersection of security, of human development, and of economic development, we understand why countries are reluctant to give up control of their borders. South Africa, well, all countries, both, are grappling with deep economic crises and development pressures, including high youth unemployment. The youth bulge is, that's something that we talk about a lot. And it's hard to ask government to provide economic services or protection or economic opportunities and safety nets to migrants or refugees when their own populations are struggling. And we have to understand those pain points if we want to really think about how to create or carve out migration governance systems that really work. But economic concerns and development concerns are just one piece of the puzzle. And here, in particular in Kenya, human mobility is intricately intertwined with security. Forced migration has been so securitized that Kenya is a global partner on the U.S. war on terror, and is one of the highest recipients of counterterrorism funding. Closely following on funding that goes to Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iraq. And what this securitization discourse enables is really an extrajudicial actions against refugees and migrants, and even local dissidents, if I may say that. So the incentives are therefore for these countries to clamp down, and so Yeah, we add on an extra layer of how liberal democracies facing a crisis around thinking about migration, what the EU is doing with borders and securitizing borders, creating containment within the continent. The incentives are not there to liberalize and to think in a common sense way about how to leverage migration for the betterment of the continent and the countries. So given these realities then, it's no wonder that all countries, but in particular what I know, the context that I know, Kenya and South African governments face deep internal and external pressures to keep borders tight, labor markets restricted, making progressive migration politics seem quite politically unpalatable. And where to from here? For people thinking about migration governance and creating systems that work for both host countries and communities, what's the room to maneuver in terms of migration policy, in terms of thinking about common sense governance regimes, which don't have this sort of backlash and this huge reactionary sort of staving off and closing and holding fort. And here's, I think, what our research with colleagues at the African Center for Migration and Society at Wits University has shown over and over again is that we have to reframe migration advocacy and move beyond migrant-centric narratives. So it's counterproductive to center public narratives on hardships that migrants face, on the sort of rights that refugees and countries have signed for refugees, when citizens themselves struggle don't have those things. And while well-intentioned, this approach often backfires, where locals, often backfire. I mean, South Africa is right now thinking about or talking about discussing pulling out of the 51 UN Convention on Refugees. For a country, for an administration that was so much around human rights and justice, and these kinds of conversations are really sort of challenging the extent to which advocacy, particularly around rights, can work. I'm not saying that we need to abandon them altogether, but I think that there might be some more ways of being more strategic about refining governance systems. Again, similarly, no amount of economic evidence or data seems capable of shifting hardline migration policies. And these arguments rarely penetrate the political calculus. So I'm just going to end by sort of throwing out there some kind of, initial suggestions or initial glimpses into some of the things that might work in real time. And this is drawn from work that I've been doing with civil society in South Africa, particularly the sort of migrant ecosystem, and with secondary cities in the Horn, which collaboration with Cities Alliance, really trying to think about how can secondary cities that are so far flung from power, from the center of power in their own nations, let alone at international level, and are so under-resourced, but have to receive, as a reality, migrants and refugees and displaced populations moving across borders around the Horn, and really think about how do you integrate, how do you even have a conversation around migration in these contexts that makes sense for both hosts, politicians, and migrant advocates as well. And I think that what is heartening about some of this work is that some of the most sophisticated responses are coming from these unlikely areas. It's like places like Koboko in Turkana in Kenya, Arua, and in Uganda, Jigjiga. It's in these places where the politics is so real, the migrancy is so the sort of the life or death is so important that are finding these spaces or these ways of navigating this difficult kind of context that we live in. And the ways in which mayors, governors, and planners and communities have worked in these areas offers a glimpse to what might be needed to push the needle on more progressive migration governance writ large across different contexts. So in this context, and this is a paper that I co-authored with Lauren Landau that was out this month. It's on environment and urbanization. You can take a look at it. It's free to download. And so I won't go into details here, but what I would like to see, what I would like to say is that a more sophisticated strategy is emerging, in these parts of strategic invisibilization and visibility of migrants. So this approach involves recognizing when to make refugees and migrants' needs visible and when to keep them intentionally low profile. One of the things that, the governor of Turkana, for example, who hosts at one point, Kakuma, which was at one point one of the largest refugee camps in Africa, I think, realized this early on. He realized that the reason why Turkana County was getting any investment whatsoever was because he had Kakuma, he had refugees in his area of jurisdiction. And what happened is that clinics and schools and economic opportunities were coming into the area because there were refugees. And what he negotiated, and I think what the new Refugee Act negotiates is this idea of investing and integrating refugees so that those investments benefit both hosts and migrant communities. I think I was speaking to a community organizer in Turkana, and she said, I will, if the government threatens to close the refugee camps again, I will riot, because the reason why we have resources now is because of those refugees and those camps. And so that's one of the ways, like being really strategic about how you draw in investments so that local populations can also be protectors of refugees. Another way is so it's about learning when to make refugees and mobile populations visible in your talk, in your sort of telling your story, and learning when to make them invisible. And here I'm reminded of the mayor of Koboko in northern Uganda, which straddles South Sudan, DRC and Uganda, and he recognized the importance of counting refugees in his planning and in his planning process, because he understood that garbage and sanitation did not discriminate between who's, this is garbage by a refugee, this is this is a flush, this was a toilet flush by a refugee, and so we won't pick that up. He recognized that these systems are so integrated, and that by counting and making sure you understand how many people are in your city or are in your town, you can actually deliver to them. And what it has caused, I mean, it's pivoting from calls to accept refugees as brothers and sisters, as we all do and as we should, but being more strategic and saying that administratively integrating refugee populations gives you a better record for delivery. So to voters, you're delivering services effectively and not creating them us versus them. But then, as a politician and as a city, you're attracting more resources for the populations that are there and that are coming. And I think the third strategy is around building solidarity. We're working with nonprofits and migrant advocates in the South African ecosystem really brought that home. I think one of the problems is that we talk to we're talking echo chambers. So we all call meetings and we all talk about how terrible the situation is, how frustrating departments like the Home Affairs are, and without thinking about how these frustrations also are frustrations that South Africans face. For example, the Department of Home Affairs, ask any South African, that's one of their worst departments. It's not just a migrant or a refugee issue. And so what about building, how about thinking about not just those talking to not just those advocates that care about migrant lives, but advocates that think about strengthening democratic institutions, for example. People who have sort of like-minded values around the rule of law, around rights, and ensuring that people's rights, whether they're South African or not, or locals or not, are adhered to by government. And I think that in building these kinds of solidarities between migrant advocates and sort of civil society writ large can help us improve the system systemically in ways that allow us to protect migrants who live among us, and also to strengthen the system in ways that ensure that we don't have a repeat of the sort of undermining of the kinds of rights, xenophobia, violence, and the undermining of rights of certain people. So I'll leave it there for now, and happy to discuss more some of these ideas about where to from here, given that we're sort of facing this kind of intractable kind of context around this migration question.
Caroline, thank you very much for those observations and those and suggestions as well. We've had a fabulous audience. We've still maintained a fabulous audience after an hour and a half. We've got another 20 minutes scheduled. I think we should go back to our speakers and let them comment on the very interesting observations made by the discussants, and give them 10 minutes, and then open up to the audience. Alan, do you want to start, or should we mix things up a little bit?
I'm easy.
Why don't you go? Why don't you start? Let's go in the order.
Okay. I think I think the risk is there are so many levels at which we need to look at this issue of migration. We've chosen in these particular case studies to look at the national level. Caroline has, I think, underlined the importance of looking at the community, local level, even the provincial level. And Amanda has talked about the regional organizations and what they've achieved. Now, in this particular project, we're not going to be able to look at the local levels in any depth, although Michael did pick up some of the issues that Caroline picked up about regional responses in Kenya to the issues. He looked at the Somali border in his paper, but generally we haven't been able to do that very much. And our next set of studies is at the regional, the supranational regional level. But this is a very challenging set of issues, and I thank obviously my colleagues, but also the discussants for a lot of value that they've added. I've made extensive notes, and I think it's going to help us in processing the material quite a lot. Just a couple of points. The balance of interest point, which both Caroline and Amanda made very explicitly. We can't be naive. On the one hand, we can't be sort of Trumpist, populist anti-immigrationists exploiting popular fears. On the other hand, we can't be naive libertarians saying, you know, it's good for the economy, we should just let it happen. We have to find a way of balancing interests. And I think that's what we're seeking. We're seeking in our project to understand where countries and regions have been able to balance interest to the point that there is an acceptance of freer pathways and safer pathways for migration within the region. The other point I wanted to get back to is, you know, both Amanda and Caroline raised points about the narrative, changing the narrative, the importance of changing the narrative. How do we change the narrative? The gap between the rhetoric and policy is already very huge. Rhetoric is very often much more extreme than the policies turn out to be. That seems to be a, you know, almost unspoken, unacknowledged truth of politicians. But it has its own negative effects, as we've seen in the kind of violent actions and the danger of populism getting out of hand on the one level, and on the other level, you know, liberals being misunderstood. Clearly, if you're unemployed, if you're one of the 8 or 9 million unemployed in South Africa, for example, and you're told, well, migrants are good for the economy as a whole, it doesn't mean anything to you. That inequality and poverty is a big issue, and we have to find a way to balance interests. And as Caroline said, we have to find a way to build solidarity and strengthen the democratic institutions that will benefit both migrants who are facing difficulties and the local population are facing difficulties. I think it's been a really helpful responses to our presentations and will help us move forward. Thanks, Ivan.
Thanks, Alan. Victor, Michael, do you have anything to add?
Just briefly acknowledging the responses from both Amanda and Caroline, and also perhaps trying to respond to the question raised by Amanda in terms of aligning the policies and the realities of people on the move. Just a very interesting question. And considering most of the studies happen in isolation, and as Alan had mentioned, I think at some point we hope to actually have a very kind of synthesized framework or paper that actually aligns the different lessons from the sub-regional as well as the national case studies. But I think one thing that really is very fundamental, ideally is, building towards, one thing that actually informed the study primarily is, building towards, enhancing the current status when it comes to the African Union Free Movement of Persons framework. And I think then this is one framework then that creates an overarching kind of framework that actually would be much more encompassing to the whole continent and could be more impactful to individuals on the move. But ideally looking at perhaps sub-regional blocks, as will be seen perhaps in ECOWAS primarily, the reality within ECOWAS, as you mentioned, historically, individuals have been moving within the sub-region, and how it has progressed now, there's much consideration of looking externally towards accommodating those, ideally not within the sub-region, in trying to maybe implement a Schengen kind of visa. But, these are just primary phases, when it comes to ensuring entry. But the subsequent phases of residence and establishment, I think those are problematic areas that are not really much dealt with, taking cognizance of issues around social security that you had mentioned. So in as much as there is some initiative and some incentive to actually, facilitate entry using the ECOWAS example, going beyond ECOWAS citizens. So my thing is, there has to be also much appetite towards residence rights, establishment rights, because those rights, though not, ratified at a continental level or regional level, they don't necessarily reflect, looking at Nigeria, for instance, within the migration policies or the labor migration policies on how, these rights actually interact with citizens and non-citizens, particularly for citizens. So I think that would be an aspect to actually consider quite in detail.
Thank you, Victor. Are you done?
Yes.
Michael, do you want to comment at all? I mean, I'm being struck by the absence in all the discussions of a certain name, which perhaps I'll say something about after Michael finishes.
Okay. So in probably, in responding to Amanda's concern about policies and realities of people on the move, I just want to not borrow a leaf from the Kenyan situation. So Kenya did adopt the Global Compact for Migration. And in fact, it is one of the 9 countries in Africa that have actually laid out an implementation plan. It's the only one with an implementation plan, but it is one of 9 that have actually joined the Global Compact. There are 2 compacts for migration and for refugees. So essentially, that is a way forward in terms of the migration discourse. It kind of highlights the practices of migration around the world for important countries, for migrants and for refugees. But in terms of actually implementing it, because out of it, our country has gone ahead and even revised the Refugee Act, giving them more rights, giving them more opportunities to work and so on and so forth. That is commendable, that you can learn from the Global Compact and extract useful legislation that is useful. But where the rubber meets the road is in terms of implementation. And that is where the stakeholders come in. For example, the private sector. So in Kenya, Equity Bank and Safaricom actually have a direct relationship with refugees to the extent that you can lend to them, you can go and assist with their learning technology-wise, offer data, so that your main objective is to enable their integration, not just stopping it at legislation. I find that this is, I think, a more practical route in terms that will enable us to achieve the objectives of integration, because we don't want to alienate them. We want to actually integrate them going forward. The migrants plus the refugees and asylum seekers, as we encourage this discourse of free movement of people. So that's it from my side. I'd like to end at that. Thank you.
Michael, thank you very much. I'm going to open it up to the floor. We still have 10 minutes. People can just signal if they'd like to say something. What I am struck by is how since the election of Donald Trump and this new emphasis on border control, I wonder to what extent this is going to change dynamics, not just in the US, but potentially around the world, and how it might affect migration management in South Africa and in other African countries as well. So I'm struck by the degree to which that was such a key election issue in the United States. Are there any questions or comments even from the audience? Raphael, do people have control over their microphones now? Maybe people could just...
In the meantime, I just want to respond to your question about Trump
Sure.
and the impact on policy. Can you hear?
Yeah.
It's something that's happening all over the world. If you look at South Africa's white paper on migration, which wasn't implemented last year, and if you look at the recent European changes in law, if you look at what Biden did in June in trying to basically fend off the Trumpists, they're all basically clamping down on refugees and trying to institute laws that make it much more difficult for refugees and for people to you know, even in the UK where I'm at the moment, there's a move towards regulations which would make it more difficult for refugees. So there is that trend, and I think that it can, you know, it's not necessarily going to happen. I don't think that all the things that the South African White Paper said last year were ever going to really happen. It was kind of an electoral ploy, but you know, if Trump does go ahead and do all those things, and if the EU goes ahead and does all the things that it says it's going to do at its borders, it might well have an effect on the rest of the world.
Do we have any?
Can I, hi, Ivo, can I come in and just
Yes, please. Would you introduce yourself? Sorry.
Amanda.
Oh, hi, Amanda. Yes, of course.
So just a response to what Alan has said, I think it's also interesting for African countries to look inwards this time. Like the data has revealed that most of the migration goes on within the continent. So I think with the rising anti-migrant sentiments, especially around certain countries, it would be good. This would be an opportune moment for African countries to look inwards to try to fix measures that would facilitate the movement of people on the continent, right? So definitely there are certain countries where there is a bit more resistance towards the movement of people. And there are other countries within the continent where there is more leeway to explore opportunities. And this is where what Caroline said was quite interesting. Also looking for these opportunities, looking for some of these solutions, and they might not be at the levels that we're looking at. They might exist. Some of these opportunities might exist at other levels. One of the things I have tried to push also in my work is to try to link the AfCFTA, African Free Trade Continental Agreement, with mobility of people. So looking at facilitating the movement of certain categories of people that are important to the AfCFTA. So sorry, that would promote the utilization of the AfCFTA. So I think these kinds of changing times can also create opportunities where you can form coalitions of the willing, several African countries, not only within RECs, so now looking beyond the regular REC arrangements, you could have coalition of the willing parties, and then we could actually see some cases of facilitating or some mechanisms for facilitating movements of certain categories of people on the continent as a counterweight to this kinds of movement, already starting from the premise that most of the movement occurs regionally. Thank you.
Very interesting. I think people are digesting what has been a very rich and a very interesting conversation. I'm going to bring the conversation to an end if there aren't any further questions or comments, if there are there. All right, in that case, I want to thank everybody for joining us. It was a very large audience. I think we've had a very exciting and rich conversation. I think the papers, Alan and the team congratulations to all of you for some very important work. Thank you to the discussants for some very interesting insights as well, and posing some really interesting questions for further exploration. I think the question of migration is, as the Trump election, as the American election has shown so clearly, is a major political and public policy issue. And I think it's of urgent. There is a great urgency in coming to terms with these issues and coming up with concrete proposals, lest they become controversial in the kind of ways which they've become in the United States. Alan, congratulations. Everyone, congratulations. Michael, Victor. On that note, I'm going to say good night. Goodbye. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Chair. Chairperson.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, no, sorry for that, man. I've been struggling to log on. My name is Emmanuel. Thanks for the presenters and for the hard work that they really did in putting together these papers. Our first seeking question is whether these papers have been peer reviewed or is just a raw material that that is being presented. Given that some of the presenters went on an offensive drive to besmirch South Africa, the question is whether those countries, for instance, where they said South Africa is bad, is it policies that are bad in South Africa, or is it the leadership that is bad in South Africa, or it is the people that are bad in South Africa? Then if maybe then is the people that are considered bad, did the papers consider the underlying circumstances that made people, this issue of xenophobia, well, yeah. So it was a reaction. It was not something that it just started out of the blue, or people just sat down, and that was a response to a particular situation. It's like now the issue of trucks that has been was done in Durban. That was a response to a certain matter. So I was just trying to check whether those people that make those comments, did they really look at the underlying circumstances, why people responded that way? And then why did why people responded that way? The other one that we would like to check is whether those countries, are they having similar challenges of a huge influx of illegal immigrants? And then if not, and then the other question is whether the issue of social network. Okay, I mean, South Africa looks like it's having a huge social network system, and then it tends to attract people to come, like people that are sitting in the borders. But we are told by the former ministers of finance that you'll find that like people in the borders next to Lesotho, people will just jump in and come here and then get the allowance and get the grants or whatever, and then from there goes back. And then I was just
checking. Very much. These are all big questions to come right at the end. Could you just tell us who you are, if you don't mind?
Emmanuel,
no, my name is Emmanuel.
Can I respond? I think
yes, sure.
They're fair questions. I hope that you read the full paper that I wrote on South Africa. I'm not excessively critical. I think that, I made the point right at the beginning of the presentation that there's been an unusually large migration flow into South Africa over the last 20 years, and there's been poor economic performance and high levels of unemployment, and that all those issues put together help to explain why people are frustrated and why they blame immigrants. Sometimes there is a direct impact of immigrants, maybe in the truck driver case, but often it's just somebody to blame. And yes, I think we do try to present a balanced picture, and we know that there are issues that frustrate people, that lead to those kinds of responses. And I think that I covered that very well in the paper. So I hope you read it. We have a website, the New South Institute website, and in that the migration governance website, and you'll find all the papers there. You'll also find our board of advisors. We have an advisory board consisting of 6 international experts, including South Africans, on that advisory board, who see every paper before it's put out and are invited to comment on those papers before they are put out. So we don't have a journal type of peer review system, but we have an advisory board which acts as a filter for all of our papers. Thanks, Emmanuel.
Thank you, Chair.
I've just shared the papers. I've just shared the link again with everybody.
Oh, okay, thanks. Thanks for the
Thank
response.
you. Thank you very much to everybody. Thank you to the speakers. Thank you to Alan. Thank you for the team. Thank you to the discussants. Good evening. Thanks very much.